What changes in China, or how imperialism really begins to take root in China, begins with what is referred to as the Opium War or Opium Wars, because there were a few of these, the first, second, and third Opium Wars. But really, they were just a collection of mid scale wars between Great Britain and China. And as the name suggests, over the production and consumption of drugs, specifically opium. And eventually, this leads to a British victory, which then further leads to China having to let the British in and do and in so very uncomfortable and influential ways. So the Opium Wars date till before our time period. They're from the 1840s. And what the Opium Wars really centered around was Great Britain. So essentially, Great Britain wanted to trade with China and have access to certain cities that would enable them to have access to ports. Great Britain, of course, being an industrial power, or an industrializing power, I should say, because this was in the 1840s. So they are industrialized, but they're still rapidly industrializing towards our point here. They want a place where they can gather raw materials and markets. And mainly with China, they were not looking so much for raw materials as they were looking for markets. And so China is very apprehensive about trading with Great Britain, or at the very least, giving the British a lot of authority to possibly lord over important key strategic port cities. So what the British do, it's actually very ingenious. The British are cultivating opium in India, nearby India, which is then shipped into China and eventually causes a massive drug problem throughout China. Eventually, opium is banned by the Qin dynasty, and truckloads of this drug is discarded and thrown into the sea. And Great Britain uses this as an opportunity, arguing that their merchandise was seized illegally, to launch an offensive against the Chinese, which became the Opium War. And eventually, as you can imagine, the Chinese, though they do put up a valiant fight, simply cannot outstand the British and their modern industrial fighting machine, and especially their navy, and they eventually surrender. The price for their resistance was a very hefty indemnity, a large amount of money that had to be paid to the British to offset the cost of the war, and access by the British government to various key ports and areas where they can sell or cultivate whatever goods and materials they want to have access to the Chinese market. In addition, although there is still a Qin monarch that is in charge and has this monarch, the Qin monarch, has more access, or has more power and authority in the interior part of the country than the outer rim part of the country. And so the British begin to institute a large number of tax reforms for these areas, specifically taxing locally produced goods, Chinese produced goods, in order to influence the Chinese market and encourage it to buy goods that were produced by the British themselves. So the British are bringing in everything from the usual stuff I mentioned before: spoons, knives, forks, porcelain products, European style clothing and textiles, things like that. And they're charging, they're bringing them in and selling them. But what they're doing is they're assessing a tax not on foreign made goods, but on locally produced goods, sort of the reverse of a tariff. So think of today's tariffs. We have, incidentally, a tariff issue with China. So think of today's tariffs. The United States is not tariffing its own goods. It is trying to tariff Chinese made goods. Here, we're seeing the British in China tariffing Chinese goods in order to force them to buy the goods that they are selling directly to China from their own market positions in these port cities. That is what they're trying to do. And so they're creating a very unfavorable balance of trade between themselves and the Chinese, although in the eyes of the British, it is a favorable balance of trade. So this is really the key moment when Europe gets its fingers into China, it is because of the Opium War. And this is later solidified. I'm sorry. Well, let me go back to this. Let me go back to that later. This is later solidified with the Boxers' Rebellion in the late 1800s, about 1899 to 1901, about 2 years. A group of radical revolutionaries in China, known as the Boxers, who subscribed to very strong anti-imperialist and anti-Western beliefs. The idea that, to borrow some language from our contemporary culture, they wanted China to be for the Chinese, not for anyone else, and they wanted China to be first. So they wanted China to be purged of all foreign influence, and so they joined with other radical members of the royal family, the Qin royal family, and they begin to push Western. Agents of Western power, what they see as agents of Western power out of China. They attack merchants who are selling Western goods, whether they are Chinese merchants or European merchants, and most infamously, they execute Christian missionaries who are practicing and spreading Christianity in China. So this becomes headline news at the time, as you can imagine. And so what happens is a coalition of really a who's who of industrial powers at this time. Great Britain really leading the charge, but also France, Belgium, the United States, Japan, Italy, Austro-Hungarian Empire, the list goes on. They all join together and launch a massive offensive against China, culminating to a series of battles in which cities like Beijing and Peking are seized by these foreign armies. We have the Germans down here, we have the British over here. I don't know who's over there, but all of these armies eventually seize various parts of China and eventually cause the government not so much to collapse, but to be completely put under the foot of imperialistic powers. Russia takes large portions of the north. They're involved. Japan, Germany, all these countries take various key port cities, river access, and they begin to exert a very strong influence over China. The emperor, or I'm sorry, the empress is allowed to remain on the throne, but really by this point she is a figurehead. One of her sons is exiled, the other is executed. Several members of the administration are executed, and all of the Boxers, all of the radical revolutionaries are executed as well. China must pay, again, yet another indemnity, and as you can imagine, more capitulation is given to these various European powers in order to keep the peace, including the station of German, Japanese, Russian, American soldiers, military garrison. China loses a lot of its military power. And these sections that are taken by European powers, including Japan and the United States, are now put really under their total control. They become zones of influence. And so, whereas before, after the Opium Wars, sections that were maybe occupied by the British were still kind of tacitly part of China and still had to obey Chinese law, but then there were British taxes that were put in place. It was sort of murky as to how that worked. Here, what we have after the Boxers' Rebellion is specific defined zones that are carved up for these various powers, in which when you are in those areas, you are subject to the laws of that governing colonial power, whether it's the United States, Germany, or whoever. Here are some great depictions. This is a depiction of one of the battles of the Boxers' Rebellion. Here's another one outside the gates of Peking. We all recognize the flag in the center of the picture. And at the bottom, you see men in cowboy hats and blue uniforms. Those are United States soldiers. Here are more United States soldiers in their Stetsons with their bolt-action rifles and their blue uniforms. They take part in this battle. Here is a parade of different soldiers outside the Forbidden Palace. And if you look very carefully, you'll see we have German flags here. We have Japanese flags. We have flags of the United States right here. And I'm certain there's probably a Union Jack around here. We just can't see it. So it really is a very cosmopolitan military power that comes into China from all these various countries. So, well, let me back it up once more. I'm sorry, because I had forgotten I had this here. One of the things that China also takes as a result of the Opium Wars and after the Boxer Rebellion really just doubles down control of is Hong Kong. And Hong Kong has been in the news a lot lately because Hong Kong has only been really a part of China in its current form since 1997. I was alive and watched the handover. They called it the quote Hong Kong handover in 1997, and that is when the British government decided to give back one of these last colonial possessions that they held back to China with some stipulations which have been, how shall we say, fueling the controversy as of late. If you go to Hong Kong today, a lot of them speak English there. They also speak Cantonese, which is their primary dialect of Chinese as opposed to Mandarin, although Mandarin is required by law. So they do speak Mandarin and they speak Cantonese. It's very popular there. They speak English. They use the British pound as their currency. And they have a Hong Kong stock exchange, very much like the New York Stock Exchange and the British Stock Exchange and the Japanese Stock Exchange. They are a very westernized entity, and they are referred to now as the Hong Kong Autonomous Area. But some of the more recent issues have been over whether or not China is violating some of these stipulations from 1997. That's very current, modern day. I will not be getting into that. But one of the reasons why you hear Hong Kong and China, they are not two separate countries. They are now one. And you're probably wondering, well, what's the issue between them? It's stemming from this period of British rule in which Hong Kong really for a long time became the subject of the British government, and had been so for a very, very long time, really from this period, let's say the 1880s up until the 1990s. So a little over 100 years, Hong Kong had been a possession of Great Britain and has a lot of these British undertones to it. Now, you can see by this political cartoon here, we have all the great powers of the world: the British, the Germans, the Russians, the French, the Japanese. They are carving China up the way we saw that illustration of the European powers carving up Africa. And we have this very stereotypical depiction of a Chinese person here in a very grotesque form protesting all of this. And we have over here more of these world powers. We have the French, I believe, down here. We have there's a lion around here somewhere. Where's the British? They're always, well, the bear is the Russians. And we have the Japanese over here, right here. And we have, where the heck are the, huh. I can't find the British. If you find the British, let me know. Normally they're depicted by a lion, and for some reason I can't quite make them out here. But all of these are world powers carving up China. Now, there is a lot of debate as to whether or not China truly was the victim of imperialism, because there are some benefits here. China, as I said, was outside the world marketplace by this point. They could not seem to industrialize. There was unrest. There was issues with starvation. There were a lot of problems in China. So, first of all, was there a benefit to imperialism? And secondly, were a number of these benefits the result of imperialism, or would they have industrialized in the first place? And that's actually hotly debated by historians today, with a lot of people believing that perhaps China would have eventually industrialized the way Japan and the other European countries have. It just would have taken a while. But there are people that still take the position that this act of imperialism really was the catalyst. Now, were there benefits? Of course, there were benefits. I should point out to you, and we should always be fair, there are good things that come from this, but we have to weigh them against the problems that are caused as well. And that's not really my job to do. That is your job, because it is up to us as historians to weigh those benefits. Some of us in this class might be Chinese or might be Japanese versus people who might be English or might be American and might have not have any say in this conversation whatsoever. But let's look at some of the benefits, for example. So, like in some of the African countries, depending on who was colonizing you, of course, because it does vary from Western European Empire to Western European Empire. Like a number of the African countries, women actually do get quite a few benefits they did not have before. Women were China was a very patriarchal society. Women were not given a lot of sway. Of course, women who were empresses and members of nobility are different, but women in general were not given a lot of sway. When the British and the French and all these other groups arrive, women are given access to education that they were not typically given. Before that, and that actually goes for everybody, because before that, if you wanted to be educated in China, you really had to be a member of the noble class. If you were not a member of the noble class, the only opportunities you really had were to join the military, which of course you had to be a man to do. And in some cases, if you had enough tutoring, even if you were not a member of the noble class, if you had enough tutoring, you could take a series of civil service exams and try to get a government job and try to work your way up the ladder that way. China is actually one of the early pioneers of that. But opportunity was very limited. When the British and the French and these other groups come in, they enact European style education, very similar to our K through 12 education. And this enabled boys and girls of all classes to receive some kind of rudimentary education. And so this benefits everybody, but especially young women who did not have these opportunities. And some women, like the woman pictured here, Qin Yen, became a very radical revolutionary later on in her life and wrote a series of manifestos about Chinese independence, and was one of the prominent intellectual thinkers that took part in the 1911 Chinese Revolution, which we'll talk about a little bit later. There were also a number of oppressive measures that were traditional in China that were removed as well. So the most famous one, and I want to give you a warning here. The picture I'm about to show you, the two pictures I'm going to show you on the next slide, are rather gruesome. So be aware of that. The practice I'm referring to in particular is the practice of foot binding. Now, this is common almost exclusively in China. It was not found in Japan. In fact, the Japanese were absolutely revolted by this. But in China, especially among the upper class, you don't find this in the lower class, but in the upper class, it was considered dignified for a woman to have small feet. And the reason why that was because small feet were considered dainty, polite, and the sign of a woman who did not work for a living. She instead lived a life of leisure, writing poetry, passing her time away in the royal gardens and palaces. And so they would wrap women's feet with these binds, which would force them to essentially go through deformity, to going from what you see here on the left to what you see here on the right. And that was considered attractive. When these various powers came after the Boxer Rebellion, the British, the Americans, the Japanese, they put an end to that almost immediately. So enacting education and putting an end to foot binding were considered to be benefits for the time. Now, that's a tricky one, because do we consider this a violation of human rights as modern day historians? Yes, we do. And at the time, there were a lot of people who were against this as well, feminists especially. But then we also had to weigh it against that idea of, was it right to use imperialism to institute the change? And that's the great trap of talking about imperialism, because we have to acknowledge that it was imperialism that brought China to its knees. But it was also imperialism that enacted education reforms and these human rights reforms that we would call beneficial. But then again, remember, the British also were getting the Chinese hooked on opium in the first place. So it's very tricky. So that concludes this part of the lecture, and we will now move on to talking about the remainder of China and then moving on to Japan.